Okay. So, there's a Kabbalist. He gets visited by Elijah the prophet, and he is offered one of two choices. He can either become as wise as King Solomon, or as rich as Jeff Bezos. So he chooses wisdom. He's a Kabbalist. So he immediately stares into the distance. He's deep in thought. And at the end, his students turn to him and ask him, "Nu, what did you discover?" So he says, "I realized I should have chosen the other option." But that's just a little lightness. So we're going to start with the question, and that is, I want you to think. You can write it on a piece of paper. For those of you who are here, you have a pad. For those of you at home, if you have the book or a piece of paper in front of you, write down in 3 words, when you hear the word Kabbalah, what comes to mind. And whoever would like to share out loud, you're welcome to share, both here and on Zoom. You can unmute yourself and just say it out. And yeah?
On the one hand, they think of very confusing spheres that they have trouble comprehending. And then the other part is the red strings and some of the actors and actresses.
Okay, so red strings, the exclusive seminars in the posh Hollywood neighborhoods, and then very deep mystical things. Okay, anyone else? Yeah?
Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai.
Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. What does that tell you about Kabbalah?
Well, he's known as like Kabbalah.
Because the author of the Zohar. Okay, very good. So there are many things that people usually associate with Kabbalah. Some people associate magic with Kabbalah, myths, red strings, as was mentioned, and others view it from. 1 second, I have to be able to see what's going on over here, so I don't know how that ended up over there. Oh, I see here. Mystical wisdom, illumination, Isaac Luria. Okay, very good. So there's a lot that comes to mind, but if we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, we probably shouldn't judge a topic by assumptions, by what comes to mind. So whatever you have in your mind associated with Kabbalah, be open to revisit those assumptions as we embark on our journey for the next 6 weeks. And we're going to experience some of it ourselves. We're going to be reading some texts from Kabbalah. We're going to be examining some of the ideas. And the main driving questions that we are going to be addressing on page 3, you have a list of the 4 questions, the driving forces behind this course, and that is, number 1, what is Kabbalah? We will address that today. And then, what are its essential teachings? We will also address, generally speaking, today. Number 3, what is the significance of some of its key terms, like Sefirot? So that is, we will be spending 6 weeks studying many of these key terms in Kabbalah. And most importantly, and we're going to spend about 1/3 of each class, as you'll soon see, discussing how the teachings of Kabbalah are relevant to my everyday life. Otherwise, what's the purpose? What's the point of the study? Now, this last question is crucial because there's a Hasidic tale of a Chassid that once went to his Rebbe, and the 4th Chabad Rebbe, the Rebbe Maharash, and the custom is that when a Chassid goes to a Rebbe, so you write down your questions on a note, you give it to the Rebbe reads the questions, and then he responds to those questions. This Chassid had 2 types of questions. He had questions relating to material matters and questions relating to spiritual matters. And he felt a little uncomfortable including both of those questions on the same note. So he wrote them in two separate notes. So when he comes into the Rebbe, he gives the Rebbe one note, there's questions about spiritual matters. The Rebbe answers the questions. And at this point, he should be leaving. But then he puts his hand into his pocket and he pulls out a second note. And the Rebbe looks, reads the note and realizes what the Chassid did, what was happening, that he was trying to separate the two. So the Rebbe responded that that's not correct. It says in the Medrash, God looked in the Torah and created the world. In other words, the Torah is the blueprint for the world. And so therefore, we cannot detach spirituality from the material world. The spiritual has to inform and influence the material. And if it doesn't, then we're going away from the purpose of creation. There's a lot of emphasis in Hasidic teachings on meditation. We study mystical concepts and then meditate on them. And there is a saying that a person should spend at least 15 minutes a day learning Hasidus. And perhaps later we'll address what's the difference between Hasidus and Kabbalah. For the time being, there is a difference, but for the time being, we're going to use those words interchangeably. And so the Rebbe asked this question, what does it mean learn 15 minutes a day? We know that we should learn more than 15 minutes a day. And the answer was, we should learn 15 minutes a day how it applies to me. In other words, you could spend hours, you can go to school for years learning a subject matter intellectually, but never once do you think about how my life should be affected or is affected or should be changed because of it. If you can spend 15 minutes a day thinking about how the Torah that you learned should impact and influence and affect your life, you're in a pretty good position. So while we are learning mystical concepts over the next 6 weeks, remember to keep your feet grounded. Take a cookie, a piece of fruit, a drink of water. We have to remain physical in the material. By the way, there are certain great people. For example, Aaron's 2 sons, that the Medrash says they expired, they died because they saw so much or understood so many mystical concepts that they wanted to become one with God, and literally their soul left their body. So that's why if you ever feel during the next 6 weeks that you can't stand the physical anymore and you're ready to just eat a cookie or something and ground yourself, and you'll be okay. So let's begin by taking a quick glance inside some of the classical Kabbalistic works. You have this in your book, these photocopies on page 4. And we're going to get back specifically to the one on the right, the one with the circles. But you see, Kabbalistic works are full of diagrams. These are just 2 examples, but they are full of diagrams. And apparently the Kabbalists agreed with the adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. But what do these images convey? What about them is mystical? So in order to understand, and this is the first question, what is Kabbalah? In order to understand what Kabbalah is, we're going to turn to ourselves, to the human being. Because although the books of Kabbalah spend a lot of time focusing on God and godliness, they also spend a lot of time talking about the human being. And the reason is because the human soul was created in the image of God. So if you want to get a glimpse of what God might look like, get a glimpse of what your soul looks like. And this we have in text 1 on page 6. Reese, you want to start?
Immortal is a mirror for the supernal reality. All that exists in both higher and lower realms is present in the microcosmic form within the human. This is the deeper significance of the Torah's statements that the human is created. Why we say, "From my flesh I envision God."
This is a verse from Job. From my flesh I envisioned God. In other words, if you look at your flesh, look at your body, look at your soul, you can get a glimpse into godliness. There was a chassid, Reb Hillel Paracher. He it was one of the big chassidim 200 years ago, and he told his followers in his older age that before he became a chassid, he despised his body because he thought his body was just an impediment to his soul's service of God. But then when he began to study Kabbalah and Chassidus, and he realized this verse from Job that from my flesh I can envision God. So I realized my body is like glasses through which I could see godliness. So I had a teacher who told us that his teacher, he lived in Montreal, and he would always share the story, and he would always say, but in order to see through glasses, it has to be clean. So if you want to look at your own body and see godliness, you have to make sure you have a clean, pure body. But irrespective of a person's personal body, they had the idea, and if you look at human nature and human character, you can get a glimpse into God to the best of our ability. So we are going to be shifting focus through the course between God and the human. And now, at this point, I want you to take out, everyone should have in their book, for those of you who have the book, you should have the map course. And it could be it's also in the student book, it's somewhere in the book. I'm not sure exactly, but if you have the book, you'll have it here. And if you look on this side, the vertical side, you'll see the right and the left side of the page. The left side of the page is the order of devolution. This is going to be what we'll call God or godliness. The right side is the human. And if you could see, you see that they're corresponding. There's a lot of correspondence between the two. Keep this page handy. We're going to be referring to it. But just, you can see, like, if you look at the human side, the mystical side will be a little more difficult to understand. We'll get to that in the next 6 weeks. But look at the human side. You'll see things that you relate to, that you understand. Pleasure, desire, discipline, boldness, right? Thought, speech, action. These are things that we understand, that we experience as human beings. And Kabbalah explains that the human being operates in a hierarchy, in a chain of command, which is why it's a vertical chart. It's top down, okay? It works in this order. So let's take an example. Most people here own a house, or own the house. You own a house, it's very easy to forget the process that led you to purchasing or building that home. But if we break it apart, the story begins with sort of an internal pleasure that a person feels he will get if he has a house. What happens when you feel this internal pleasure? If I would have a home, how enjoyable it'll be. This creates a desire. If it'll bring me so much pleasure, now I want a home. Okay, but just because you want a home, not everything you want do you do. Then it comes down into intellect. You have to justify. you have to make sure you're able to afford it. You have to make sure it's in a place that will make sense in relationship to your work, to where the kids go to school, to where your parents live. There are many logistical and intellectual thought processes that go along with it. Then you also have to explore how it will work emotionally, how it's going to make you feel. Just because it's worth it for me to be in this neighborhood, but if I'm going to feel constantly trapped by the homeowners association, or by the school district, or by the local government, or whatever it is, or by the neighbors, so that might make a difference. So where will I feel comfortable? Where will I enjoy more to be? Then once it makes sense on paper, then you start thinking through the plan. You want to think about it again and again and again to make sure. Now, do you rely on yourself, or do you consult with people? Most people, you want to consult, you want to speak it over to your friends, to professionals, to experts, perhaps, if you're in the type of field that needs expertise. And then once everything happens, then you're ready to act upon it, to shake hands or to sign. And this is the hierarchy on this page, on the map. It begins all the way from, we'll soon see, it begins really above that, but it begins with pleasure and desire, and it goes all the way down to the bottom to action. And so that's what we're going. However, for this course, we're going to work our way up. We're going to start at the bottom. So you'll see the colors on the map. Today we're going to be focusing on the blue, next week on the green, then on the yellow, then on the red, then on the yellow on the top, and then we're going to go off the charts. Last week is not on the charts because there is no definition, and there is no name, and there is no expression in any way, shape, or form. So you would think that God wants a world. Well, now there's a world, right? That's the way it should work, but it doesn't. Just like by us, from the desire to want a world, there's a process till it comes into action. We are created in the image of God. Why do we operate that way? Because by God, it's the same thing. When God decided he wanted a world, it went through a devolution. There was a process, a chain reaction. There was a process that he went through till he came to creating our world. And this is a term that we're going to use on page 7. You see key term 1.1. Seder Hishtalshalut. Or I might read it, you might hear me referring it to in the class as Seder Hishtalshalus. That's just because the way but the root of the word Hishtalshalut comes from the word Shalshelet, which means a chain. But a chain could be horizontal, it could be vertical going down, it could be vertical going up. Hishtalshalut focuses on the descent. Okay, so that's why it's called Seder, not Seder Shalshelet, but Seder Hishtalshalut. And this is going to be sort of like a ladder that we're going to walk down from. We're going to start at the bottom. But the way the process works in the real world is coming down the ladder. And that's why it's called Seder Hishtalshalut. If you look at, so now if you turn over your map to the other side, you'll see this page has key terms. There are 41, I believe, 41 key terms that we are going to be learning over the next 6 weeks. The first one is a real tongue twister, and it sounds very mystical. When you get home tonight, try practicing saying these words, Seder Hishtalshalus, or Seder Hishtalshalus. Yeah, this is the first one, and this is the system of devolution. You don't have to understand anything yet. We're going to get to understanding throughout the next 6 weeks. But these are the key terms that we will address. Okay, So now let's go back. Let's go back to oh, I see. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Yes.
What does devolution mean? I know evolution.
So evolution means going up. Devolution means going down. Evolution means evolving from the lower to the higher, right? Devolution is the other way around. So now let's go back. By the way, the plan is to finish the class by 8:30. Sometimes I don't make it, and we have to go a few minutes over. And these classes are jam-packed with good stuff. But if there's any questions, if you don't understand something, if it's a question that's not directly related, we can leave it till 8:30. I'll accept any questions. But if it's a question to understanding, you can either type it in the chat if you're on Zoom, or you can raise your hand or unmute yourself or ask the question. There was a Jew. He had a non-Jewish friend, and the non-Jewish friend wanted to come to shul with him. But he didn't, he wouldn't know and understand what's going on. So his Jewish friend sat next to him during the prayers, and the whole time, everything that happened, they stood up, they sat down, they opened the ark, they closed the ark. He was constantly explaining to his non-Jewish friend not only what was going on, but the mystical meanings behind what was going on. After the reading of the Torah, the rabbi gets up to give his sermon, and before he starts, he takes his watch out of his pocket and he puts it on the podium. So the non-Jew asks the Jew, and what's the significance in that? So he says, absolutely nothing. So we try to keep time, but sometimes we get a little carried away. Okay, so now let's return to some of the original questions that we started the class with. We'll begin with what is Kabbalah. So I think we have a pretty good understanding. Not understanding because we don't understand anything yet, but an idea of what Kabbalah is. Kabbalah is an understanding of the systems and of the processes through which God created the world, and the fact that it very much mirrors the human being's personal experience and identity. Okay, and just like the biologist examines the human genes, and the computer scientist breaks apart the computer to understand how the computer works, so we are going to try and understand how the world works based on how the world was created, and we'll also see how the human works. There's one important thing to keep in mind, and that is that we are talking about non-material realities. We're talking about spiritual things. Let's go to text 3 on page 8. Drake, you want to read?
The saintly Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov taught that when studying works of Kabbalah, we must be careful not to perceive the Kabbalistic ideas as literal, physical concepts.
You remember Amelia Bedelia, where she was told to put the lights out, what she did? What did she do? She took out all the light bulbs and hung them on the clotheslines outside, right? She put the lights out, right? She took it literal. So it's very important to remember that when we say we're going to be talking in very human terms over the next 6 weeks, we're going to say this is higher than that. It doesn't mean that it's like 10 light years away instead of 5 light years away, right? When you say in a business, you'll say this person's higher than this position is higher than that position. It doesn't mean it's necessarily on a higher floor. Right, you can have the CEO and his secretary working on the same floor. The secretary may be physically taller than the CEO, and yet you would say the CEO is higher than the secretary, right? Because we understand that when we use these rankings, we don't mean literally. So it's very important to keep in mind that we're talking about we're not talking about physical altitude or physical space. We're talking about spiritual space. There is a story a cute story that Hasidim used to share. There was a city in Russia called Dvinsk. Dvinsk had two rabbis. There was a Hasidic rabbi and a non-Hasidic rabbi. The Hasidic rabbi, his name was the Rogachover. That's what he was called. A very famous Torah authority. And the non-Hasidic rabbi was the Or Sameach, Meir Simcha HaKohen. And the Or Sameach was very, very tall. The Rogachover was very, very short. And a child once heard two adults arguing who's higher, the Rogachover or the Or Sameach. And the child looks at the adult and says, I don't understand. Everyone knows that the Or Sameach's taller. So the adult says, yeah, we don't mean taller physically. We mean in spiritual stature and in knowledge. And the kid says, so the first time when you realized that your argument made no sense, so then you reverted, you found like another interpretation of what it could mean. You're going to hear terms, and then we're going to say, yeah, but it's not to be taken literally. The problem is if you first see it literally and then you try to take it out of its literal context, sometimes you get stuck in the literal and you think, well, why are you taking it out of its literal context? But we have to understand when we're addressing spiritual issues, from the outset, we're talking about spirituality. So even if we use a physical term, remember that we're describing a spiritual entity. And it's going to happen. We are going to get caught up in the physical terms. We just have to remind ourselves not to get caught up in the physical terms and remember that it's the spirituality we're after. Now, why? This is the how of Kabbalah. So what is Kabbalah? Seder Hishtalshalut, the order of devolution. How do you learn Kabbalah? By exploring godliness, by exploring the soul, and remembering that it's a spiritual entity, not physical. Why is it important to study Kabbalah? Why did you all come out here, and why do we spend hours a day studying Hasidus and Kabbalah, focusing on these things? So, because JLI said so. So that's a very, very high level to reach, that whatever JLI says you do. The first is theological, right? If you believe in God and God gave you a Torah and mitzvahs, so you want to understand who is this God. You want to learn about what's going on over here, right? So in order to understand your religion and what your religion wants you to believe and wants you to think and wants you to do, so you probably want to understand it a little bit. That's at its most basic level. However, the Kabbalists show how if we understand how the computer works, that will help us make better decisions in the future. If we understand how we work and how the world works, in other words, if we understand God's thought process, then like for example, ChatGPT comes out. I don't know if you know what ChatGPT is. I'm sure by now most of you know what it is. But at the beginning, most people didn't know what to do with it, what type of questions to ask it, right? But the more you learn about it, the more you understand how to interact with it. But if you don't know anything about it, if you don't know how a computer works or how a car works or how an air conditioner works, so then you don't know how to operate it and what to ask it to do for you. So if we want to understand how we should go about our lives, what type of choices we should make, how we should prioritize things in our life, if we understand how the world works, this can help us, and this really underscores how the study of Kabbalah is not really extra. It's not something, if you have time for, study it. It really is an essential part of Judaism, of a Jewish way of life. But the Kabbalists took it a step further, and they said that if we operate in the image of God and we understand how we operate, so now we have some sort of understanding how God operates. So if we make certain choices, we can actually affect things above. In other words, if we're in the image, usually the way it works is if you're a copy of someone else and you make a change in the copy, it doesn't change the original, right? But if there is, if they're syncing, if the files are syncing between the two computers, then no matter which document you make the change in, the changes will sync to the other document. So if we understand how we operate and how God operates, then if we make changes to our operating system, we might be able to affect changes in Seder Ishtalshalos. So it can actually be very beneficial. Okay, this is all general ideas of what is Kabbalah, how we are to study it, why we should study it. Now let's spend some time actually studying a little bit of Kabbalah. And as I mentioned, we are going to start at the very bottom of the map, the blue part of the map. And for the next 25 minutes, we are going to be discussing the left side on your map. This is the end of Seder Hishtalshalos. Okay, before we get to the very bottom circle, the physical Asiya, we're first going to address the smaller circles, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. What are these words and what do they mean? So let's go to text 4 on page 9. Jesse, you want to read?
The Zohar discusses the existence of 3 spiritual worlds.
Oh,
That one or 3?
no, 4. Text 4. Huh?
God's glory.
Okay, God's glory includes Bria, and God bestowed this unto the human. God's glory includes Yetzirah, and God bestowed this unto the human. God's glory includes Asiya, and God bestowed this unto the human. Thus, the human is rendered in the image of the supernal glory.
Okay, so in this passage, we learn that there are 3 spiritual worlds. The names for these 3 spiritual worlds are taken from Genesis chapters 1 and 2. When the Torah describes God creating the world, it uses 3 different expressions. Bara, like in the very first verse, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created. It also uses the term Yatsar or Yetzira, and it also uses the term Asa. Right? So if you look through chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, you will see, if you want references, I can give you after class exactly which verses, but if you read through chapters 1 and 2, you obviously have to read it in the Hebrew. You will find these 3 verbs. Now, the names of the 3 spiritual words are the noun forms of these verbs. So we have bara. The spiritual world is called Bria. Yeah, that's the first. That's the first world on your map. In the blue section of the map is Bria. The next one is Yetzira, and the third one is Asiya. Okay, and we know that we have these 3 worlds in our personal lives as well. Okay. Now, if you go back for a second to page page 5. It's going to be very hard to see this, figure 1.3, but if you know Hebrew and you have good eyes, if you look at the circles, not at the outer circles, but at the more inner circles, you will see that about 6 circles from the center is at the end of the word, at the end, like there's three words, but it says Bria. The next line, the middle word is Yitzira, and the next line, the middle word is Asiya. It's difficult to see, but these are basically the lowest levels in the spiritual worlds. Okay, now this leads us to our second word to learn in your it's actually in your books also on page 10, but it's 1.2 on your key terms, and that is the word biyah. Biyah is obviously an acronym. It doesn't actually mean anything, but it is an acronym for these three Hebrew words, right? Bria is the bet is for Bria. The Ya, the Yud is for Yitzira, and the Ayin is Asiya. Okay, this is the facts. Now, why do these worlds exist? Why are there three worlds? What's the purpose? So let's go back to the beginning and ask the question, what was accomplished when God created the world? When God created the world, what changed? What wasn't there before that's there now? Us. Okay, what else? The heavens and the earth. So on its most basic level, there was no physical creation. There was no world, right? But in a more spiritual sense, creation introduced a very important shift into the world. Up until creation, there was only one existence in the world, God. You can't imagine this, but take a minute and imagine you somehow ended up in this world before the world was created. And you went over to different particles and you asked them, what are you? They would say, what do you mean, what are we? We're God. No, there was no identity outside of God. There was nothing outside of God. When God created a world, what happened was now there is something. Now it's true. Everything is really a part of God. But from the creation's perspective, I exist. There is an existence. Okay? So we don't know yet what this existence is. The existence may not even know, and we're going to bring a metaphor in a second. The existence may not even know what it is, but we know that it exists. In Hebrew, this is called Yeshut. Yesh means it is. Yeshut means there is an existence. There's something here. It may be the loftiest spiritual soul or angel, but at the end of the day, it has an identity that's not God. That was affected through creation. This is the third term of the day, and that is Yeshut. Yeshut, again, means I am, existence, that there's something there. Now, Rome wasn't built in a day, and Yeshut didn't emerge in one swoop. It took time, it took a process from when God introduces Yeshus into the world, existence into the world, until it comes down into me and you actually feeling like we're something. When someone asks you, describe to me who you are, the average person doesn't say, what do you mean? I'm a creation, I'm part of God. Right? We identify ourselves, we have a name, we have an identity. But how did we get from the beginning to here? In general, when you develop something, there are three general stages. Let's take childbirth, for example. So it begins with an embryo. Yeah, an embryo has very little observable shape or character, right? It's just an embryo. You don't see a human being in the embryo. And then what happens? The embryo turns into a fetus. Now there's already starting to develop a shape of what the human being could potentially look like. And then at a certain point, this child develops into a full human being. In a similar way, when Yeshus first emerged, when God first created the world and Yeshus emerged, there was something, but it was unidentifiable. You didn't know what it was because it was still very close to God. And so it didn't have, it had an identity, but unobservable. There was no real observable identity outside of God. And then you get to Yetzirah, right? That's Bria. That's the first world. The next world is Yetzirah. Yetzirah means formation. This is already, there's some identity, but it's not a full-blown independent identity. At this point, the child can't survive outside of its mother's womb because it's not it's not its own identity yet. However, at a certain point, the child becomes an independent identity, and that is the world of Asiya. And this is actually very well conveyed in the names of these three worlds of Bia, right? So the word Bria, you see here, page 11, you have a diagram here. You have Bria. This is the initial appearance of a novel entity. Now, what degree of self-awareness does this initial entity have? Nothing. Think about when you're thinking of an idea. When the idea first enters your mind, it's not an independent idea yet. It's still very much a part of your mind. You can't, at that moment, write it down or convey it to someone else. It's not developed. It's still a real part of you, but it is an idea. It's an idea that will eventually gain its own identity, but at this point, doesn't yet have its own identity. So this is the creation of something from nothing. In other words, to get from 0 to 1. To get from 1 to 2, that's not creation. That's not creating a separate identity. But to get from 0 to 1, this is a whole new world. And therefore, when you get from 0 to 1, you have to go slowly. You start at 1. It's not yet. And therefore, it doesn't even, it doesn't necessarily feel itself distant from the Creator, from God. But then you get the Yetzirah. This is shaped. And its degree of self-awareness is intermediate. Yeah, so this is already a pre-existing idea. It existed before, and now it's just getting some shape and character to it. It's starting to get its own identity, but it's not yet independent entirely. And then we get to Asiya. Asiya has the completion or the evolvement of the idea until it's totally independent and can stand on its own. This is once you've finished the task, you've built the chair, you've painted the picture, you've written the book, and at this moment, whatever it is you created is now independent of you. You could go away, you could send the book to the other side of the world, and someone can read the book with no connection to the author of the book, knowing nothing about the author of the book. They may not understand the book the way the author intended for it to be understood if they don't know the author. And that's why we're trying to understand the author. But if you look at a book, you can understand the idea as long as it's a self-sustaining idea. But this is the lowest level. So all three levels have something in common and something unique. The commonality between all three is that they are an existence outside of God, their own existence. The difference is, relatively speaking, how separate from God do they feel? In other words, how much do they feel themselves? Does that make sense? We're going to explain this, and soon we're gonna see how it works out in the human being. And I think hopefully it'll come clear how it works. But generally speaking, if something here isn't understood, please let me know. That's why, if we go back to this circle, you'll notice two interesting things. You're not going to be able to see it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It's going to be hard. You know what? I think there is a way for me to point. 1 second. How do you point? Where? No, that's on the side. How do I point on the slide? Oh, that's added, I think. Oh, pointer here. 1 second. Visible. Do you see my pointer? No, on Zoom. Do you see the pointer on? You do. Okay. So you'll see some interesting things here. First of all, over here, the higher levels that we're going to explain next week, it doesn't say olam. It doesn't say world. But when we get to Bria, it says, it says olam hapirud. That means a world of separation. In other words, up until this point, these 10 levels, it's all part of God. The point where there is a separation is olam, is Bria. Bria literally means creation. This is where God creates something external, an existence on its own. There's another interesting thing you'll see. If you look at the outside circles, they all have God's name. Now, it doesn't actually say a hey. It says Yud Daled Vav Daled, because we don't want to write out God's name in case it gets, not treated respectfully. But you'll see the outer 10 circles have the name of God. But when we get to Bria, you see inside the white circle, there the name of God isn't there anymore. And the reason for this is because this is where an independent existence outside of God begins. Right? Let's read a text here to understand a little bit of why there are these three levels that we go through. Text 5, on page 12.
There are three rods. Bria,
Yetzira, and
Asiya.
Asiya.
Beria is the first introduction of
Yeshut,
an independent self-concept. However, existence only develops into a complete yesh when it reaches the third stage.
So why? So in other words, it takes 3 stages. Why isn't the baby created like that? Why does it have to go through the different stages? Why did God need these 3 different worlds? Okay.
The reason Yeshut develops gradually is because the initial stage of existence remains close to God, and his presence is very much ascendant at his third level. At this level, then Bria developed into Yetzira, where the presence of God somewhat concealed. Finally, Yetzira develops into Asiya, where God is completely concealed at this point. Existence becomes a true yesh and gains a complete sentence of selfhood.
Okay, let's take an example of a teenager. We're going to examine 3 different types of teenagers. If you ask a teenager, who are you? What do you believe in? So you'll have, let's call her Sarah. Sarah she's mature enough to know that she's an independent person, that she's separate from her parents, that that she should have her own identity, but she struggles to express or even really understand what makes her unique, what makes her different. What are the things she believes in as herself, not the things she was told to believe? What are the things she relates to or has a passion for, as opposed to the things that she was told to have a passion for, etc. Then you have, at the other extreme, you have Rachel. Rachel is entirely more adult-like. She knows exactly what she wants. She to the smallest detail, she can explain how she's not like her parents. And she can even distinguish herself from her friends or family that are very similar to her, that other people would say, oh, you're so similar to this person. She can define how she's different. And then you have Rebecca, she's in the middle. Why does this happen? So one of the reasons this can happen is the parents' proximity to the child's life. So Sarah, her parents are very involved in her life. They dictate where she goes, what she does, the things, the friends she interacts with, the subjects she chooses in school. They're very they're dictators, and they control her life. She hasn't been given the opportunity to figure out who she really is. Rebecca, her parents did give her a little more room, but they still are interested. They try to, push her in one way, gently push her in one way or the other. And Rachel is entirely independent. Her parents let her make choices. Obviously, they try to lead her in the right way, but they demand that she sort of figure out right from wrong. Now, in short, it depends. My self-awareness or self-concept depends on how close I am to my parents. The closer I am to my parents, the less self-concept I have of myself, because I'm consumed within my parents. When does a child get their own identity? Now, it's important to remember, like everything else, we are talking about spiritual things, and we're using physical metaphors. So it's not a perfect metaphor, because in the metaphor, most people would look at this and say, well, Sarah's parents are very overbearing, helicopter parents. That's not a good thing. However, here we're suggesting that Bria, because it's so close to God, has less of a self-awareness and a self-concept, and that's a good thing. Okay, so it's not identical. The metaphor is not identical. We have to remember that almost no metaphor is going to be identical. There's always going to be differences between the concept we're trying to understand and the metaphor we're bringing. But this is the idea. When God creates an independent existence, because it's the next step outside of God, it's too close to God to feel its own existence. So if we were stuck in Bria, we would be so overwhelmed by God's presence. It's almost like we would live close to the sun. We wouldn't be an independent. We'd be consumed within the sun. We wouldn't be our own existence. So God had to make a second world and then a third world. In other words, had to push us further away from the source, so that we shouldn't be overwhelmed by the source, and we should be able to have an existence, an identifiable existence. So Yeshut, or I want to stick to the Yeshut, which means existence. What's the opposite? So Yeshut, you would say, on the world of Asiya. In other words, the complete Yeshut. A complete existence is the lowest world, Asiya. Bria, the highest world, there is Yeshut, there is existence, but it's in a way of bitul. This is the fourth term on page 13. Bitul means surrender. In other words, it's an existence, but it surrenders to its parents or to its source. Yeah.
Talk about this in the past as a positive, as a major positive thing.
It is. And we're going to see, we're going up the ladder. Bittul is the closer you get to God, the less you feel your own existence, the more bittul you are. Yes, okay, yes. We're getting there, But you have to understand that God created the world with this process of devolution. The purpose is all the way at the bottom. The purpose is here. But why do we know all this? Because we have to understand how the process works. We also have both sides of the coin. We'll soon see. Once we get to the practical side of it, you'll see how it connects. So like I said, there's...
This is an ignorant question, but my frustration is why is the goal to surrender everything about the self? If the self is the goal of the creation to be...
The goal isn't to surrender everything of the self.
Isn't that what Bittul is?
Yeah, but the goal isn't, that's why I said, if you feel like you are going to get to Bittul, eat a cookie, ground yourself, because that's not the goal. The goal is to live both worlds, to be able to elevate yourself to Bittul and at the same time stay grounded. We're going to see how this plays out in our day-to-day life. By the way, for those of you who are familiar with the prayer, in the morning and evening prayers before the Shema, we make a blessing. And in the blessing we say, Yotzer Or Uborei Choshech. Yotzer Or means you formed light, Uborei Choshech, and you created darkness. Remember, Borei is Bria, that's higher. Yetzira is lower. So you would think light is higher than darkness. And yet, we associate light with Yetzira and darkness with Bria. And the reason is very simple. When you turn on the light, now you see everything in the room. You see how it's an independent existence. But if the light's off, if it's dark, you don't see the things in the room as independent existences. You just see the room. Or you know that they're there, but they don't look as independent existences outside the room. And that's why darkness, in a way, is higher than light. And that's why it's Bria, right? Because it's closer to the source. So you see less of the independence of it. However, after these three worlds, we get to the metaphysical side of Asiya. There is the spiritual Asiya, and then there is the physical Asiya. That's the world we live in today. The physical material world we live in is the physical side of Asiya. So, where is Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya? Where are they? How many light years away are they? They're not. They're realities that we can live in. So it's literally a state of mind. So if I feel distant from God, I am living an Asiya reality. I feel my own existence. I don't feel God's existence. I'm living in Asiya. But if I live and I sense God's presence, it doesn't have to be 24/7, even if it's only for 5 minutes. I'm sensing God's presence. For those 5 minutes, I am now living a Yetzira reality. It's all here. It's not like, remember, it's spiritual. It's not like it's up there, inaccessible. It's here. It depends how big of a yesh I am, or how batel I am. How much of that's bittul. That's so how much of an existence I feel myself, or how surrendered I am to God. And if I live and by the way, sometimes you have this, let's say on Yom Kippur or some other time where you're overwhelmed with God's presence. You know, I don't know if you watched the videos from yesterday from the Israeli soldier that was rescued from Gaza. So you sense God's presence when you watch the reaction. When you're living that experience, now you're living in Bria, in the world of Bria. Because you recognize and you're overwhelmed by the fact that God's here with me right now, right here, right now. Now you're in Bria. You're as close as you can get to selflessness, to not feeling self. I've shared the story many times. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was imprisoned in 1927 by the Soviets for the crime of teaching children Torah. In the Soviet Union, you were officially allowed to be religious, but you were not allowed to teach religion even to your own kids. So the previous Rebbe had an underground network of schools to teach kids Torah, and he was eventually imprisoned and sentenced to death. And during his interrogation, one of the interrogators put his gun on the table. The previous Rebbe writes in his diary that he decided he's not going to treat. They were acting like animals. He wasn't going to treat them he wasn't going to dignify them with responses to their questions. So he didn't respond to their questions. So the interrogator pulled out his pistol and put it on the table and turns to the Rebbe and he says, "This toy has made many mute people speak." So the previous Rebbe, unimpressed with his threat, said, "This toy can only scare someone with one world and two gods. But someone who has one God and two worlds, this toy doesn't impress." Now, usually the way we always understood the story was that the previous Rebbe didn't care if he would die because ultimately his soul will go up to, he has another world, an afterlife. But that's not really what he meant. What he meant was that someone who has one plane of reality, everything begins and ends with my identity and with the gun's identity and with what's going on in this room. So if I have no other choice, I'm going to talk. But someone who lives in a world where there could be other states of mind to be in, the previous Rebbe could put himself in a state of mind where he isn't impressed with a gun. Someone can raise themselves to a level that things that may impress or instill fear in someone don't impress or instill fear in them. Let's go a little bit into the human being and we'll have a better understanding of God. No, okay. Let's explain. You see here in the map, you'll see that in the green, it says soul powers. On the right side of the map, in the green, it says soul powers. This we are going to study next week. Today, we are studying soul garments in the blue. Soul garments, not soul powers. What's the difference between soul powers and soul garments? So I want to do a little exercise with you. If you have a pen and paper, write down 2 + 2 = 5. And I love moldy tofu. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being easy, 10 being difficult, how difficult was it for you to write that down? Huh? A number, 1 to 10. How difficult was it for you to write it? 3, huh?
10 being like the hardest or 10 being
10 being the hardest. How easy was it for you to write it? 1, 2, very easy. Okay. Now, turn to the person sitting next to you and say the same thing. 2 + 2 = 5. I love moldy tofu. You could say it to the screen for those of you who are on Zoom.
2 + 2.
How difficult was it to say that?
3.
Maybe a little more awkward, but okay. Now, I want you to think. Just think the words. 2 + 2 = 5. I love moldy tofu. You all thought that, right? Was it very difficult? Okay. Now I want you to understand 2 + 2 = 5 and to feel that you love moldy tofu. By raise of hand, did anyone understand 2 + 2 = 5, or did anyone feel a love towards moldy tofu? No. What do we see from this exercise? What we see from this exercise is there is a big difference between the soul and behavior, or what we call the soul garments. Okay? This is it's hard to see on the screen, but now we're going to the right side of the map. Now we're going to the soul garments. The three worlds that were Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya in the human being, they are thought, speech, and action. If you want an easy way to remember it, whenever you want to go on a flight, you have to go through TSA. Very good. Thought, speech, and action. Okay? So anytime, okay, so now, now let's understand that when it comes to the soul itself cannot understand 2 + 2 is 5. It's just intellectually not honest. It can't understand it. And it can't feel something that it doesn't feel. But thought, speech, and action operate outside of yourself, outside of your soul, which is why, as we just demonstrated, it could be quite easy to think, speak, or do something that your heart and mind cannot understand or cannot feel. And by the way, this is also expressed by the duration. Okay, so doing something. How difficult is it to stop doing one thing and start doing something else? It could be very difficult. But in other words, okay, rephrase the question. Or I don't even know if there's a good way to phrase the question, but it may be uncomfortable or inconvenient depending on what you're doing. If there's something you want to be doing versus something you don't want to be doing. But from a practical standpoint, when we're talking in the world of action, how difficult is it for you to pick up the cup, want to drink, but forget about the wants? We're not thinking about the wants and desires, and then put the cup down, or to put the cup down and pick up something else. To switch from one action to another action is not difficult. What about speech? Now, hopefully at a certain point, I will stop talking, right? Most people eventually stop talking, or you talk about a different subject. Also not very difficult. You could switch topics like that. Even thought, which Kabbalah says thought is constant, what you're thinking about doesn't have to be constant. You could be daydreaming now, and if I say don't think about a pink elephant, what's everyone going to think about? Pink elephant, right? How easy was it to switch what you're thinking about? So even now, it could be difficult, but it's possible. But a person who's naturally kind and can't discipline, how easy is it for them to become a disciplinarian? In other words, not how difficult is it for them to discipline. How difficult is it for them to become a disciplinarian? For someone who is very analytical, how difficult is it for them to become creative? Usually, the way you are, you stay pretty much the same way. You learn how to work within that world. You learn how to deal with those things. But who you are is very difficult to change. Here's another. So we see that thought, speech, and action are very different than who you are. They are what you do. This leads us to the last term for today, and that is on page 14, Levushe Hanefesh, the soul garments. So now we understand Levushe hanefesh. Levushim are garments, hanefesh of the soul. Soul garments. Now I think we understand how thought, speech, and action correspond to Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. What was the point of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya? The beginning of something independent of God. Thought, speech, and action are independent of who I am, which is why I could think something that I don't believe. I could say something that I don't understand, that I could do something that I don't want to. Yeah, because it's external. It has its own identity. Again, this corresponds to Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Now, there's also an individual correspondence, right? Think of a family member or a friend that you love. Think. Now, it's going to be hard for you on Zoom, but if you're sitting next to someone, it might be possible. Okay, now try using gestures to the person next to you to express that love. Not to the no, it doesn't have to be that you're talking about the person next to you, but with gestures, try to describe the love for whatever person you're thinking of. Only gestures. Okay, now, if you want, you can verbally express, you don't have to mention the name of the person, but you can try to verbally express, and if you don't have someone to say it to, you could say it quietly to yourself. Try to express how you feel about the person that you're thinking about. Now take 10 seconds and think about your love to that person. Just think for 10 seconds about your love to that person. When were you able to feel more of your love? When you thought it, when you spoke it, or when you expressed it in action? In thought, right?
Yeah.
Thought is closer to the person. It's closer to you. So you were able to feel those feelings, those expressions. Speech is one level separated from you. So it was already harder, right? Sometimes you say the feelings, I can't find the words to describe it, right? So in your mind, you had the words, you thought about it, but you can't find the words to express it because you're trying to distance the words from yourself. And then when it comes to gestures, I mean, very hard to describe with gestures what you're feeling. Again, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Bria is very close to God, and therefore doesn't have its own identity, therefore feels very much godliness very much as its identity, doesn't feel its own identity. Yetzira is one step removed. There already is external things, but it's one step removed. Whereas Asiya, it's a whole personal identity. You don't even see the relationship with God. You don't even see the relationship with the Creator. When you're making gestures, you don't know what the person's saying, who they're talking about. You don't know. Is this understood? Okay. Now, on pages 18 through 21, I think, you have there, we're not going to read it now, you can read it after class, but there you have I'm sorry, someone had a question? There you have some information about these three worlds of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, and how they relate to angels, souls, and paradise, Gan Eden. Again, you can go through that afterwards. Okay, so we really didn't get to, and we really need to spend a little more time on this. Practical. How does this inform our practical life? So let's now take a step and discover how this is relevant in our lives. One second. Do you know the joke about the Jewish mother who was was sent home from duty. You know why she was sent home from jury duty? You ever heard the joke? Huh? Because she insisted that she was guilty. That's the joke. We often struggle in our lives. On page 22, there's a list. You don't have to share. You don't even have to write. I want you to think one of these things in this list that you aren't challenged with, and one of the things in this list that you are challenged, that is a challenge for you. I want to choose one. Which one should we choose to discuss? Let's choose jealousy. Okay? We're learning about Biyah teaches us something very important about our own character flaws.
Not at all.
That our character flaws are in who we are. Yeah. But even if my natural tendency leans towards jealousy or arrogance or laziness, whatever it is that my natural tendency leans towards, I could still think calming thoughts. I could still think humble thoughts. I could still think productive thoughts, right? Even if my character is more cynical, I can still speak favorably of others. Even though in my heart, what am I feeling? I'm feeling very cynical, but that doesn't mean I have to speak cynically. And even if I'm a very anxious person by nature, I can still think calming thoughts. So just because, a lot of times you'll hear people say, what do you mean? That's how I feel. I have to be honest. That's what I thought. So that's why I have to say it. No, just because you feel something, not always do you have to say it, do it, or even think it. Yes, it could be difficult, but it's possible. Yeah, we tend to be very consumed and worried about what's under the hood, who we are, what type of tendencies do we have. We shouldn't be so concerned with that. We should be more concerned with am I allowing it to express itself to the detriment of myself and others? Or am I in control? And you'll see on page 24, this is what makes a mensch. How do you say mensch in Hebrew? Huh? In Hebrew. Adam, right? Adam is a man, right? Adam isn't male or female. Adam is a human, a mensch. Look at, I'll put it up on the screen also, but if you look at the word Adam, it's 3 Hebrew words, 3 Hebrew letters, Aleph, Daled, Mem. Okay, in English, this is going to sound like an A. Now, the Aleph is a little different than the rest, but the word Aleph means something. What does Aleph mean? It means like to learn. Aluf means like an expert. So, no, that's Aleph. Aluf is like an expert. So, Aleph refers to thought. Dalet stands for dibur, which means speech. And the mem is for ma'aseh, which means action. So what makes a mensch? If you're in control of your thought, speech, and action, then you're a mensch. And to bring out how extreme this is, I want to read for you text 8. There was once a sage who sent a drawing of his face to physiognomist. Anyone knows what a physiognomist is? A master who discerns temperament and character from one's outward appearance. Very good. When the master saw the drawing, this is brought down in a book called Shita Mekubetzes, written by an Egyptian author, a rabbi that lived in Egypt in the 16th century. When the master saw the drawing, he immediately blocked his face in fright. The messenger who brought the drawing asked him, "Why have you blocked your face from looking at the drawing?" The master replied, "I've never seen the face of such a horrible person before. I saw in him coveting, adultery, and robbery. One shouldn't gaze at the face of such evil." Now what happens when he has to come back to the sage who sent him? The messenger was obviously terrified of bringing back this reading to the sage. However, the sage sent word that he should return without fear. Upon his return, the sage inquired about what had occurred. The messenger conveyed everything that he had heard, concluding, "That's why I was afraid to return to you." The sage replied, "Surely this physiognomist outshines all others. Everything he said about me is true. My internal inclination drives me and seduces me to commit all of the wrongdoing that the master saw. Yet I use my wisdom to refrain from acting on it." In other words, just because you see someone that looks very holy, very refined, and very spiritual doesn't mean that inside doesn't have the same evil inclination that you do. Why does he look different than you? Or why do you think he looks different than you? Why do you think he's different from you? Because he may control himself more than you. Why are there people that you look at that I'm better than them? You may not be internally better than them. You may have much worse desires and inclinations in you that the other person doesn't have. But the other person is in less control than you are. And therefore you think you're better than them. Because you control yourself more. This is the beauty of understanding Biyah. When we understand Biyah as being something separate from who we are, we understand that if we want to change who we are, that's very difficult. To change who you are, how you think and how you feel is very difficult. Almost impossible. And really, that's who you are. Why should you change it? But we understand that it's very possible to change how we behave, how we are on the outside.
Want to do the mitzvahs, just do the mitzvahs. Understand later.
They say beauty is on the inside, and there's a lot of truth to that, but there's a lot of beauty on the outside as well. There's still a little more. I want to conclude. It's 8:30. I want to conclude with something a little more practical. You'll forgive me for going a few minutes over time. When it comes to mitzvahs, when it comes to serving God, we have mitzvahs that are very actionable, very much mitzvahs of action oriented, right? For example, giving charity. Yeah. Then we have mitzvahs that are primarily speech, prayer, Torah study, speech, but also thought, because you have to understand what you're saying and what you're studying and what you're doing. Yeah. So there are mitzvahs that cover all these categories. Then we have mitzvahs that have all three, or most mitzvahs really have all three. There's the action of the mitzvah, putting the penny in the charity box, putting on the tefillin, lighting the Shabbos candles, or whatever other mitzvah you're doing. But then there is a lot of mitzvahs have a blessing you say before you do the mitzvah. Some mitzvahs, kiddush, you pick up a glass of wine, but you also say the blessing of the kiddush. And then there is the intention behind the mitzvah. what you're accomplishing, what you're doing, why you're doing it, etc. We all have weaknesses in some of these areas. Some people are very much action-oriented. Some people, and they can't think through things very much. Some people love to think through things, and it never gets to action, right? Right? They say so. The guy said, "I always wanted to be a procrastinator. I just never got around to doing it." So there's a deficiency that we all have in either one, two, or maybe even all three of these garments. We have to look for the things that are challenging to us and try to master them. Try to master our thought, speech, and action. Forget about what you feel. Not forget about, you have to remember that to know where you have to control yourself, but forget about changing how you feel or how you think. Start becoming a master of what you do, of what you speak, and once in a while, even what you think. And this is how a Jew begins every single day. If you we'll read text 10. This is from the Code of Jewish Law. I'll just read it. As soon as we wake up, we should contemplate before whom we are lying and become aware that the King of Kings is close at hand. As it is stated, the entire earth is filled with his glory. It is best to habituate ourselves immediately upon waking to recite Modeh Ani. I thank you, living and eternal King, for you have mercifully restored my soul within me. Great is your faithfulness. This will remind us of God's intimate presence and inspire us to rise energetically. Seeing that the Modeh Ani does not include a divine name, we are permitted to recite it before ritually washing our hands. Then what do we do right after that? We wash our hands. In other words, action. So here we have thought, speech, and action in a mitzvah that we begin our day with. It begins our day, we understand and we focus. What am I going to conquer today? What am I going to focus on today? I'm not going to focus on feeling less lazy. I'm going to focus on being less lazy. I could feel lazy throughout the whole day, but I'm still going to do something. I'm going to put on a face as if I'm interested. I'm going to do things and try to say things and maybe even think things that may go against who I am and how I feel. And this is what we learn from the lowest of God's creations. This is creation. This is the world we live in. Next week, we are going to go above creation, before God created the world. And this is really, to get back to what Jeff asked at the beginning earlier, that the parents that which way is better, that the person should be closer, feel himself as his own identity or not. And the answer is the parents, they want the child to be an independent identity, but they want the child to adopt their morals and values. They want the child to look as close as possible to them while being as independent as possible from them. Right? They want, at the core, the child should take as much of the parents as possible while being its own personal identity. Okay, I'll just conclude with a story that will help us understand what it is, why we should feel empowered to continue the study of Kabbalah and understand what it's accomplishing. So the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement, was once noticed that one of the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, his name was Pinchas of Karetz, was very disturbed by the spreading of Hasidus, the spreading of mystical concepts. And he felt that these are too lofty and too delicate to be given to the masses, that it has to be guarded, it has to be protected, which, by the way, it was for hundreds of years until the Arizal came around in the 1500s and said, now is a time, it's a mitzvah to reveal this wisdom and to spread it. So the Alter Rebbe calmed him down with the following parable. There was once a king who had a son, an only child. And this child became very ill, deathly ill. And none of the doctors were able to find a cure. So the king made a proclamation that whoever can come up with a cure will be rewarded generously. And every doctor came to look, no one was able to figure it out. Till one guy came and he said he has a cure. He's not sure, but if there's a cure, this is going to work. But it's a little difficult to get the cure because the cure is to find a rare precious stone, to grind it into fine powder, mix it with water, and have the prince drink this mixture, and that will heal the son. The king was overjoyed. Finally, someone has a solution. The problem is this stone is so rare that the doctor doesn't know if you could possibly find it. But when he tells the king which stone it is, the king says the crown jewel of the king's crown is that type of stone. So he tells his servants to go get his crown, to remove the crown jewel from the crown, and to grind it up. Right then, the doctors come running into the throne room, and they tell the king that the situation got so bad that they can't even administer liquids into the son isn't swallowing anything. They can't even administer liquids. And they were sure the king would scratch his idea of grinding the crown jewel. And they were surprised to see the king said, so let's go quick. Let's grind it quickly to see maybe we could still succeed in getting a few drops down his throat. Now, the Rebbe used this as a metaphor to explain why it is that after hundreds of years of the great sages not studying Kabbalah, these mystical concepts, why it is that we have to study them today. That it came to a situation after we were exiled from Israel, after the great Torah centers of the previous millennium were dissolved, and it became a time where Jews were lost. Going back 300-400 years, they were getting lost. They were living in small villages amongst the non-Jews. They were just uneducated and becoming very distant and very far. And Judaism in general was a very dry practice. You did what you were supposed to do. There was lacking soul, and there was a big danger that people would give up. If you're doing something just as a robot, it's difficult to continue doing it and to pass it on from generation to generation. And here, the Alter Rebbe was suggesting that by spreading these ideas and by studying these concepts, we are hopefully, God is willing to, happy to spread the secrets of the Torah, even though they may end up in the garbage or in places that are not respectable, so to speak. It's worth it, maybe to save the king's child. So thankfully, we had a chance today to consume some of this powerful remedy, but it's the beginning of our journey. So we will see you all next week, 7:00, to continue on to the Sfirot, to the soul powers. Let me stop the recording, and then I will take